Ms. JerriAnne is the Executive Director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire and the previous Director of Diversity Programs and Community Outreach at the University of New Hampshire. JerriAnne was named one of the 25 Extraordinary Women of Southern New Hampshire by the National Telegraph in 2015 and named the 2017 Freedom Fighter by Seacoast NAACP, and in 2015, she was named by the New Hampshire Humanities Council, yay, as one of the 40 most influential New Hampshireites who've vastly enriched human understanding in the context of the Granite State. She serves on the Advisory Committee for New Hampshire Listens, and if I'm not mistaken, JerriAnne, you just recently joined the board of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Without further ado, I give to you Ms. JerriAnne Boggis.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for that introduction, and thank you again all for being here. Today's program I'll talk about Juneteenth, its history. Sorry, I have to fix my screen as Anthony does this, get us ready. And we just completed our 4th year of Juneteenth celebration. This year, our program offered by the Black Heritage Trail was a little different since we had to do virtual programming. But today's program for you, we'll just talk a little bit about the story behind the celebration of Juneteenth, how this holiday has been celebrated in New Hampshire, and why it is more important now than ever to really acknowledge this piece of our history in this historic event. So my talk today is on Juneteenth, an historic celebration of Black liberation. And I'll start off with, Anthony's gonna be advancing my slides and I'll be talking. So thank you, Anthony. So in order for us to understand the significance of Juneteenth, a word that is the combination of June and 19th, put together, Juneteenth, we should first examine the significance we place on another holiday that is at the heart of our nation's most cherished symbol of liberation. Every July 4th, we celebrate our Independence Day, a commemoration of July 4th, 1776, when the Continental Congress officially adopted the final version of the Declaration of Independence. Here I wonder how many of us ponder the full meaning of the words of that declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths, I'll just say it again, to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I wonder if we recognize the paradox between the patriots' demand for liberty and the widespread acceptance of slavery, where, as the signers of this declaration, as they were signing this declaration, there were 9.6 million Africans who were being kidnapped, shipped to the Americas, and sold into slavery. And even some of the signers of the Declaration were enslavers themselves. Next slide, Anthony. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the words in the Declaration of Independence, expressed the aspiration of this new nation. All men are created equal. But the Declaration did not extend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to Native Americans, African Americans, indentured servants, or to women. Jefferson, a lifelong slaveholder and another founding father, did not insist on the abolition of slavery. In a nation that declared itself to believe in freedom and equality, that decision had to be justified. And how we justified this was by making Native Americans and Blacks defining them as an inferior race, and therefore were not fully human. As you can see from some of the pictures, some of the inhuman treatment that were posed upon our enslaved brothers and sisters. It would take 87 more years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment to end slavery. Or did it? Did that 13th Amendment really end slavery? Next slide, please. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. As the nation approached its third year of a bloody civil war, the proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. Now that addition, within the rebellious state, meant that the proclamation applied only to states that had seceded from the Union states, leaving slavery untouched in the loyal border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware. So President Lincoln didn't really feel all the slaves. Almost 500,000 men, women, and children were still held in bondage when this Emancipation Proclamation was written. Delaware had about 1,798 enslaved people, the District of Columbia 3,185, Kentucky 225,000, Maryland 87,000, and Missouri had about 114,000 enslaved men, women, and children. Next slide, please. At the time, despite Lincoln's best attempt to preserve the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation still wielded little power in any territory not yet under the control by the Union. Enslavers in Confederate states often sought out loopholes to hold onto their human property, moving them into states where there were minimal number of Union troops enforcing the new executive order, Texas being one of those states. Now, if you were to search the internet for the story of Juneteenth, you would most often read that on June 19th, 1865, Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas, where the enslaved population had not heard the news that the war had ended and they were now free. Note, this was 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had become official on January 1st, 1863. If you were to continue reading, the story would go on to give various reasons why the enslaved population was oblivious to their free status. They would say, some writings would say, news traveled slowly in those days, or another myth was that the messenger died en route. Plantation owners want to get in one last crop, so they did not free their slaves. And all the enslaved were illiterate, so they couldn't read the proclamation anyway. So those are just some of the myths that were being told. Next slide. The General Order number 3 that was read stated, and I'm reading in quotes, the people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and of property between former master and slaves, and the connection herefore exists between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, there's also some real problematic stereotypes within this reading, and that those people who were enslaved were to stay and become employers, hired laborers, to their enslavers, collect wages, and there would be no help from the government at all, and they need not be idle. So people who were enslaved were left on their own. Of course, the reaction to this profound news ranged from pure shock to immediate jubilation. Most former enslaved people weren't terribly interested in staying with the people who had enslaved them, even if pay was involved. In fact, some were leaving before Granger had finished making this announcement. What followed Granger's news was called a scatter, when droves of former enslaved men, women, and children left the state to find family members or more welcoming accommodations in northern regions. Slide. There are several problems with how the story is told, the normal mythology that we read. It is doubtful that the enslaved Africans gathered in Galveston who heard the proclamation were as lacking in knowledge of events as the popular narrative would have us believe. This would not have been the first time that the enslaved had heard of Emancipation Proclamation, or the first time that they had heard that the war had officially ended. Moreover, it is a narrative that installs General Gordon as the hero of emancipation in Texas, thus effectively erasing the story of Black people's own contribution to their freedom and their political consciousness, which is really a significant part of the story. From research work that's been done, Texas represented the westernmost edge of the Confederacy, but it was not a sealed-off state. In fact, by the end of the war, it was home to thousands of slaves whose master had refugeed them to Texas to prevent their escape to the Union lines. Some 15,000 slaves were taken to Texas after the Union forces captured Vicksburg. These enslaved people would have brought news of the war to the enslaved population in Texas. They would have told how the Union armies were doing, and especially they would have spread the news about the Emancipation Proclamation. There was lots of little infighting rebellions going on way before Granger came and delivered that speech on June 19th. But what Granger's proclamation actually brought, which was the deciding factor, was news, along with news of the emancipation, was the crucial promise of force. Within weeks, 50,000 US troops flooded into the state in a late arriving occupation. These soldiers were needed because the planters would not give up on slavery. Next slide. To sustain slavery, some planters systemically murdered rebellious African Americans to try to frighten the rest into submission. A report by the Texas Constitutional Convention claimed that by 1865 and 1868, white Texans had killed almost 400 Black people. Black Texans, on the other side, the report claimed to kill 10 whites. Other plantations hoped to hold on to slavery in one form or another until they could overturn the Emancipation Proclamation in court. Against this resistance, the Army turned to force. In a largely forgotten or misunderstood occupation, the Army spread more than 40 outposts across Texas to teach rebels that the idea of law as an irresistible power to which all must bow. Freed people, as Hayward quotes reminds us, did not need the Army to teach them about freedom. They needed the Army to teach planters the futility of trying to sustain slavery. So June 19 marks the beginning of another in the long fight African Americans have fought to gain their freedom. And it's still relevant today. Although changes didn't happen overnight, the free slaves in Galveston used Juneteenth to begin claiming their victory. Gathering together each year, freed enslaved people used the date to measure progress against freedom and encourage one another in their path forward. Over time, word of the celebration traveled across state lines by word of mouth. The people from Texas took Juneteenth Day to Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, and other places they went. But it was the civil rights movement that eventually blasted the event into the national spotlight, as you can imagine. Next slide. Today, 47 states recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday or a special day of observance. After years of being one of the few remaining states that do not recognize Juneteenth as a holiday, Governor Chris Sununu signed SB 174 into law, proclaiming an annual observation of Juneteenth. Two of the states that I know of that don't celebrate Juneteenth are the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. In this picture here, we see Senator LaVake, who brought the bill to the floor, Senator Fuller Clark, Senator Hennessy, Senator Khan, Senator Soucy, Senator Waters, Senator Long, Senator Hills, Harry Gathright, and Representative DeLorenzo were crucial in bringing the SB 174 to our state. Next slide. Before the Juneteenth celebration was widespread, many towns celebrated Emancipation Day, and especially up here in the North, and they celebrated it on around January 1st. There's not documentation that states that on January 1st, 1882, Miss Katie Brown read the Emancipation Proclamation. There was also a celebration again in Portsmouth in 1958, when the newly founded local branch of the NAACP received its charter. A local high school girl, who some of you may know as Miss Valerie Cunningham, was invited that year to read the Emancipation Proclamation. Portsmouth New Hope Baptist Church began sponsoring Juneteenth activities by around the 1990s, and celebrations in Portsmouth have continued to today. The Black Heritage Trail have celebrated Juneteenth now for 4 years in a row with extensive programming, an educational piece, celebration piece, and a honoring of the ancestors at the African burying ground. We just completed this year's program, an online program, with the same thing. We did it over 4 years this time, a little bit different instead of the one-day festival that we usually celebrate. Now, Juneteenth is more than just a day of remembrance. It is good news that needs to keep spreading. Respect and appreciation for all of our differences grow out of exposure and working together. And that's what our program is about, really sharing African-American history, because African-American history really is Americans' history. It's an important part, and it's intertwined. Juneteenth is a day for us to measure our nation's progress in battling inequalities, no matter how slow it comes, and a day that is needed now more than ever. And that's the PowerPoint presentation. I look forward to your questions, to answering some of them, and to dialoguing with Anthony if he comes back.
Here we go. I'm back. I was managing that. So
Thank you.
yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Tricia, for putting those links up. As you can see there in the chat function. Oh, sorry about that. I see that. So you can see the next function. My apologies. I'll do that. So I just want to let you know that you all can see there's a hyperlinks. Obviously, they're in the chat function to the Black Heritage Trail as well as to NewHampshireHumanities.org. Before we open up for just general questions, real quick, JerriAnne, I just got one kind of an easy one and maybe a bit of a toughie. If I'm not mistaken, Texas was the first state to make Juneteenth an official state holiday, right?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, they just made it in 1971. And we as a state just did it last year, right? So that's 40 years later it took us to make it official holiday. How much longer do you think it's going to take for Juneteenth to become maybe a national holiday? And if, you know, people like myself or our allies wanted to see to try to make that happen, I mean, what's going on? Where are we at in that debate right now? Because I know it's out there, it's being discussed currently, and I'm just curious what we're doing as a state, or we're part of this, this discussion at all, or where does that stand right now?
Well, right now, I think Juneteenth's been in the news a lot because of a controversial statement made from the White House that, you know, they've just discovered that we all just knew about Juneteenth, which is not true. But we should take advantage of this moment, of that Valerie Cunningham in her wisdom said, we are the flavor of the day. So if we are the flavor of the day, then we need to take advantage of getting our history and bringing it together to America's consciousness. And I think the more we put on, the more we share, the more we talk about it, especially when we connect the stories. 4th of July is coming up, and we're going to be talking about American independence. And we're still going to forget about June 19th. When we think about July 4th, we forget that at the time of that signing, that over 500,000 people in the country were enslaved. So when are we, and when we look currently at our issues, our divisiveness, our inequalities, the disproportional treatment of African Americans, not only in our judicial system, in our healthcare, in our schools, right across all the systems, we know that we still have not addressed the issues of inequality. We have not. So the more we put this on, the more we can start at a national level recognizing our story of enslavement. Juneteenth is a way to start doing that, by honestly looking at our history of enslavement and say, nationally, we're celebrating this moment of the people's freedom. We can start that dialogue on a national level. So if we all write our Congress people and and do what we can, our state, they are states that have made it. And what's interesting is that a lot of the businesses, we can learn a lot and take a lot from our businesses, who gave their employees the day off, acknowledged it in some way. Google did, Twitter, and a lot of companies. I saw a list out there of 30 companies that gave the day off. So if the businesses are doing it, and we were worried about as a national level of creating yet another holiday, and the businesses took that first step, we don't have anything to say. We can just do it.
Gotcha. It looks like Connie just had a comment. She said she had heard that Jean Shaheen had sponsored a bill to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Connie, when did she do that? Do you know offhand?
I heard that last week on NPR. Yep.
Well, I know Cory Booker and had also sponsored a bill, and so had Kamala Harris and other people. So I know the bill's out there. So it's just to get it through to be recognized as a national holiday.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is not the first effort this has been made into a national holiday. No. This effort to make Juneteenth a national holiday began shortly after Texas had instituted the first state national holiday, and it was still in the 70s when the first bill was put forward in the House.
And President Obama did put it through too when he was in office, but it failed in the Senate. Gotcha.
JerriAnne, we've got a question from Miss Jen Booth. Let me read this to you. First, and I'll just read the whole thing. First, thank you for your time and sharing with us. You mentioned that this holiday is based on what happened in Texas, right? So again, the idea that General Gordon made those slaves, and keep in mind, if I heard you correctly, JerriAnne, those slaves were moved to Texas because there were less Union soldiers there, so they could continue benefiting from free labor, even after the Emancipation was signed. Again, it took 2.5 years. Her question is, was this also a time when those held captive in other border states were notified and freed, or was Texas the last state to do so?
As far as we know, Texas was the last state to actually emancipate the enslaved. Now, it's hard to tell if there were individual people still being held as slaves by slave owners. In New Hampshire, we said that we had no enslaved people after the last census, and I think it's 1830s or something like that. But the records show that we did have one enslaved person in Hollis as late as 1840. So I can't imagine not being able to have the law at all spots at all times, that there may not have been enslaved people even after Texas. But as officially, Texas was the last state to then enact the Emancipation Proclamation.
It looks like Tom's got a question. Tom?
Thank you. Yeah, this is really Tom, not Mike Paulin. So
Right,
first of all, thank you, JerriAnne. This was fabulous. Anthony and Connie, thank you. How do we coalesce? It seems like it's going to take a continuous educational effort combined with specific actions. For example, I know it's probably news to a lot of people on this call that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free up the slaves in some of the northern states. I know when I've mentioned that in casual conversation with people, people are shocked. So it seems like we need continuous education, but at the same time, do really specific actions. Like we're going to be staying in our lane, focusing on the oral health disparity of peoples of color in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. So it seems like we need specific actions, but it seems like we also need, continuous and constant education. So it's a daunting task, but I think really doable. But I commend your communication and your educational efforts, because repeating the same stories over and getting it's so necessary. So thank you. But do you agree we need to simultaneously do stuff but also continue to educate?
Absolutely. This is like, I hate to use this analogy, but it's what comes to me. It's like a war. You have strategic plans on all fronts. We have to start with the individuals, right? For ourselves, learning, figure out where our own biases are, to really explore that. We have to work in our communities. We have to work in our legislation, and we have to act. Whenever I think of, there's a story in one of our Black histories in Portsmouth that I like to talk about, because it shows the problem where we are. Even when we know something, it goes against our beliefs, so it's harder to change. So, for example, there was an enslaved man, Primus Fowl, in Portsmouth, and from his birth to his death, he died in his 90s. He worked at the printing press, and he was in charge of laying the letters out, right, for printing. And on his death, in the history of Portsmouth, the Rambles of Portsmouth, it said that he was illiterate, right? He was severely illiterate. Now, any thinking person, if you really look into that, would know that he could not be illiterate and be in setting the typesetting for the press. But people choose to believe that narrative, even today, because it's part of that historical record. But if we look even, with our 4th of July, with our Emancipation Proclamation, and we really look at these documents and really want to face our history as individuals, we'll see the irony, we'll see the hypocrisy, and we'll actually see through the falsehood. We just have to be willing to really say that maybe, hey, we're not this, we are something else. And so we have to start the work to really get to this promise that we say is America.
Thank you for explaining that strategic and tactical approach, and also that it does create a bit of discomfort with your release, and also it also has to come from the individual. That was well stated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can build on that too, Tom, you had said something earlier as well, which is, to the 81 people who are on this call right now, that, that it took 2.5 years for some slaves to be made aware that they were free. I would suggest to you that slavery never ended, right? So for those of you who like to read the book, I'd encourage you to read the book, The New Jim Crow. If you're not familiar with that book, it's written by Michelle Alexander. She's an amazing author. There you go. There's a plug. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And really looks, because, if you look at the 13th Amendment actually allows for indentured servitude or slavery. And it's through the growth of our penal colonies. And so during Reconstruction, what would occur is this work still needed to be done. And so it would just be done by leveraging, I got a traffic ticket, so therefore I'm going to be interned for 6 years in hard labor and chains. And so it's a really interesting book. So the name of the book is called The New Jim Crow. It's written by Michelle Alexander. And if you like documentaries, I encourage you to watch the documentary 13th. And it's on Netflix. It's free. So I think we all, in ubiquitous, we all have Netflix now. It's informed by Michelle's work. It's an extraordinary book. And some of us who've read it and appreciate her work would suggest to you that slavery quite didn't end at the end of the Emancipation Proclamation or at Juneteenth. It continued, albeit in a different form.
Thanks, Anthony. That's so true. I can't say anything else more to that, but that, you know, the work that we're doing, especially Delta Dental, is looking at the disparities in dental health, goes all the way back to enslavement. You know, all of these systems, you can link them back to the treatment and the belief that African Americans are not quite human. They're different, so we can treat them badly.
Which, man, I've got a question. I think let's flash forward to today. So how is Juneteenth celebrated today within our local community? Now, it's regional. We understand that. But, you know, for those who are a little less familiar with Juneteenth, how is it celebrated today? I can share my personal experience, but I'd rather hear yours.
Well, I'd love to hear your story too. So I'll say that I am originally from Jamaica. So my experience of Juneteenth is different than African Americans' experience of Juneteenth. I'm coming to this from a new perspective and from the work that I do. So for what we do for Juneteenth, it's a celebration. It's emancipation. It's a symbol of a fight for freedom and emancipation. So we always include something celebratory. We always include food, as it's traditionally celebrated across the America. And we add our educational piece. There's always when a family get together, African Americans do these family reunions all the time. So Juneteenth is almost like a family get together. And as a matter of fact, a lot of families celebrate Juneteenth in that way, with food, with music, and always learning about the past. We add in an African tradition, the honoring of the ancestors, because it is their journey that brought us to where we are. Their resilience, their quest for survival, their keeping traditions that really meshes into what we know as African American culture. So we try to put all those things. Anthony, one of the things that I saw that a group was doing out of Manchester this year that was really, hats off to them, they really did well, was to combine the celebration with the COVID-19 testing, because we know that African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And so that was one really symbolic way of really addressing the current disparities over the Juneteenth. So yeah, I thought that was really good.
We've got a couple questions and just real quick, we would celebrate it just from my tradition. We'd have the Ida L. Clark family reunion. It'd be all around then. We would all come together in Springfield, Ohio. We were all Appalachian Black, brought from the South, and we settled in Bowling Green and then made our way up to Springfield, Ohio, is where my clan were to come from, actually Harveysburg, Ohio, country boy. And we would come together and we would do precisely what you would do. We would cook, we would talk, we would have fun, and we would enjoy each other's experience. And we would pour out libations in remembrance of the spirits who came before us. So here's a great question from Connie. And so I'm just going to read it to you. So there are so many ways to correct the record and share information about the reality of the Black experience in our country. Here's the question, JerriAnne. How would you recommend, or where do we begin? What material should we read? What are there books out there we can share with our children, movies that we should watch? Are there other resources out here that you think are really great resources that are easily accessible that we could start our journey on together?
I should have prepared for this because we do have a reading list. we have a reading list. If you are in New Hampshire, visiting our website, there are 80 stories on our website at blackheritagetrailnh.org under our lengthened project that are directly related to New Hampshire. Valerie Cunningham's book, Black Portsmouth, really started this journey for us. And our own Harriet Wilson wrote a book in 1859 called Our Nig, or Sketches in the Life of a Free Black, that starts this journey right here in the North. Of course, there are just tons more books. I think, I'm trying to remember.
Well, as you think, I just want to let people know too, on our Black Thought website, we also have some resources for folks. And so, for example, The Origins of Race in the USA by Dr. Daniel Bainbridge, and she did a great overview, which is available to watch. Black America Since MLK and Still I Rise, that PBS special. That was a wonderful series that we've made available for download. Remember Shadows Fall North, JerriAnne? I mean,
Our own film.
On your own video. We link to that on our website. We also have a wonderful fact sheet on Juneteenth put together by the federal government, and a wonderful resource that we just recently found, and it's entitled Talking About Race, and it's the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. They've created a new online portal. Extraordinary amount of resources there, extraordinary. And so all those are accessible for download. All you need is that magic thing called the www.
There's another one. Henry Louis Gates and his group had done one, The Illusion of Race. That's a series I think PBS had done too, which is really good. And for people who are looking at the white side, White Fragility is really an excellent book to read to try to understand where we are.
JerriAnne, didn't you have that author actually at one of your Black New England conferences? I mean, that's something locally that people could go to and attend. So can you tell folks about the Black New England Conference, how long you've been doing it, what a person could expect? I mean, it's multiple days now. It started as one day. I mean, it's just grown.
Yeah.
You and I have been working together.
Yeah, so the Black New England Conference will be in its 14th year this year. We're going to be going virtual for the first time, so that's interesting. But we started at UNH, and with a focus on the 3 states, because there's so much that we don't know of New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont when it comes to Black history. But it's grown to encompass all of the state, and we've had international, regional, and national presenters where we focus on, we take an issue and focus on that issue that's broad reaching. This year's theme is, it's titled Black Woman Rock, a look at Black females activism throughout history. And now it's an election year and women are at the forefront. So we want to take a look at that in our Black New England Conference. And we'll bring together scholars from all over to dialogue about some subjects, whether it is historical, activism, feminism, and just where we are, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, a lot of the movement that were led by women. So we'll take a look at that. It will be over 2 days. It's usually over 2 days. We usually have a big function, a dinner, an awards dinner, and keynote speakers. We'll see how it is when we finish planning, dealing with COVID reality, just what we do.
Right. So it was saying the possibility that it might be a virtual event. So if folks would want to go, and let's say, for example, they couldn't have gone to the face-to-face, there may be an opportunity for them to participate virtually.
Absolutely. It will be a virtual program this year. We've made that decision. So now we just have to work. We're partnering with Southern New Hampshire University to create the virtual program this year.
And I guess I got to get an unsolicited plug-in for Delta Dental, if I'm not mistaken.
Delta Dental, they have always sponsored our event. Since Connie came to the first one when we were at UNH, is it like 5 years ago now, Connie? I'm not sure. I think
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. I went to 3 different ones, and then the year I was traveling, I sent Evan to be in my place.
Yeah, and from the first one she came, she was hooked and kept sending people or coming. So yeah, we're very grateful for Delta Dental support. Very thankful.
And so, today's topic was the oldest known commemoration or history of freedom around Juneteenth. So any more questions around Juneteenth, the history, the makings of it, all those kinds of things? If not, we can continue with this conversation, because this is a really worthwhile conversation around opportunities for learning that might be available to people that we might otherwise not be aware of. And so particularly at a time like this, creating this space for conversation is pretty good. Look, we've got Tom to stick around damn near the entire meeting. We've only got 12 minutes left, and he's still here.
I wouldn't miss this. And JerriAnne, thank you for your leadership. Anthony as well, and of course Connie, and thank you for, again, the framework: educate, action, and self-awareness. It means a lot. So keep it going, and we're going to be in our lane dealing with the oral health disparity. And thank you for your leadership. And we'll be back. So thank you. So for colleagues, I have to split, but stay on if you wish. Thanks again, Anthony and JerriAnne.
Thank you so much.
See you, JerriAnne. Bye-bye. Bye, Connie.
JerriAnne, I do want to touch upon an earlier point that you brought up that I thought was important. And, I grew up with the term whitewashing. At age 50, that was the term I grew up with in terms of the whitewashing of history. And so kind of what you described when you talked about, General Gordon going into Texas and the mythology of General Gordon going into Texas and letting these folks know, and the whitewashing of history and how that all happened, right? How illustrative is this experience to other experiences in history? You point to, there's other aspects of this. I was thinking, for example, today of Nancy Pelosi and the most recent work in terms of the Confederate monuments. I didn't realize that there are 30 states within Union that have Confederate monuments, right, that are used as a way to kind of whitewash history. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Because this is something I'm particularly interested in, and I'm curious from your perspective, how does that impact honest dialogue? I mean, we talk about reparations. Well, reparations begin with repair, and you can't repair unless you're honest. So I'd be curious your thoughts around this particular issue as well.
So Anthony, you just threw out a whole bunch of things right there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, they're really, really good. And I'm going to start from my own story. So I grew up in Jamaica, and all our heroes are Black heroes, and all our Black heroes were formerly enslaved men who rebelled against their status. So our stories have never been of the enslaved as being uneducated or lazy or any of those stereotypes that we have of enslaved people here. Our heroes, our enslaved people, were all heroes. So when you come and you look at American history of enslavement, the stories we tell, we whitewash, we erase the times where Black rebelled. And if we tell the story of rebellion, then they're all killed, they're all destroyed, they're all, gotten rid of, and they were evil, and they were horrible people, they were monsters, right? We create this abhorrence for the story of rebellion, right? So Black folks in America, as the story would have us believe, were not self-defining, right? They couldn't tell their own story. They didn't fight for their own freedom. They were followers, and this kind of, on one hand, these monsters, on the other hand, these unintelligent people, not fully human, not fully developed, not self-determining people. So when you look through the story, most of the stories, they're erased, they're wiped out. Like the African burying ground, they were not valued enough where the African burying ground could have stayed and remained. We had to build on top of it, get rid of the evidence, remove the bones, remove the story, So that's normally when you try to think of American history. We've never had a moment of reconciliation, right? Where this national dialogue on race, where these stories can be told, where you can see the effect of enslavement today. All these other countries that have had genocides, that have had the alienation of a whole race of people, they have come together in some form of reconciliation and reparation. You know, we make this big argument that there can be no reparation for slavery, but we paid the enslavers the value of their enslaved person when we had the emancipation, but the people who were doing their work had nothing, you know. So we only tell one narrative here, and that narrative is at the detriment of an underrepresented group. That was one of your stories, you know, just how we do it. I mean, the whole Confederate statue is a whole nother story, you know, of wanting to hang on to a lost cause, to a story that never was. You know, it represents something that I don't know any other culture that puts up, and this is my opinion, puts up statues to represent the person who went against the Union, you know, a traitor, you know, and honor that, and then use that as the symbol of what that represents. You know, Germany, there's no symbol to the Nazis, you know, but we have an honor, a big part of the country, and even in the North. I mean, that's the one that blows my mind, that the North, who is supposedly have won this fight in the Civil War, would put up statues of Confederate statues. It speaks to something else. And I think it's time for us to be really honest about that dialogue of what it speaks to.
Gotcha. Well, gosh, if any, you know, Tricia, you know, Dr. Tricia Pion, I know she's on the call today, and you know, she's a great historian, and she and I have talked in the past about that particular issue around Reconstruction and the use of Confederate monuments during Reconstruction. It means to remind folks that I guess in theory, that the shall rise again. Tricia, I don't think I did it justice, did I?
Yeah, you did a good job.
No, she's just saying that. Hey, listen, there you go. You know, I wanted to provide an opportunity for some closing comments, but Tricia, I did want to ask you to share with the folks, you know, we have our programming coming up for Black Thought, you know, this Friday, coming up. I want to remind folks about that again. So if you're interested, you can find information about our Black Thought series at nhhumanities.org, and you can register for Friday's event. Again, it's called My Problem with White Jesus. And again, just to read it again, Dennis Britton, Dr. Britton, will discuss the medieval and Renaissance representation of white and black skin and consider how they affected the way we feel about the sacred value of that skin today. And this actually came from a conversation that he began at JerriAnne at a program that you ran. But we've also had some other exciting programs coming up, Tricia, too. I just want to see if you can update folks coming up on from our HCG virtual programs coming up on Friday as well. Have you got some other ones?
Yeah, we have Dr. Cabria Baumgartner's program in that same series, in the Black Thought series, coming up on July 10th, so the week after 4th of July holiday. Dr. Baumgartner will be talking about medical history and race in the US with a couple of different epidemics, comparing the yellow fever epidemic of the 1790s, today's COVID-19 outbreak, and the racial disparities in both of those. And actually this Thursday, there's another Humanities at Work presentation with Delta Dental. Michael Tugias will talk about his book, The Finest Hours, which is about a sea rescue, a Coast Guard rescue at sea off the Massachusetts coast. I think that's Thursday.
Great. So it looks like Delta Dental will be back. JerriAnne, any final words, any plugs you want to get in?
Well, we'll be having our community reading of Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech on July 3rd. It will also be available. We did a broadcast with New Hampshire Public Broadcast TV, so I think they're putting it on July 4th. That's our next coming event, and then of course we'll move on to the Black New England Conference. But you know, come see us, visit our website, blackheritagetrailnh.org, and you know, ask a question and be involved. It's just being curious about the things that we don't know and just asking a question. There's never a stupid question. So if we don't know, we just have to ask. And I think if we all just start wanting to know about this history, that we can just get one step closer to erasing those stereotypes and creating a more inclusive community that could be more equal and more just to all of us.
And the dates for this year's Black New England Conference, again, JerriAnne, are?
September 25th and 26th.
September 25th and September 26th. And I'm going to put one last date, October 22nd. Will be a third date I'm going to ask you put on your calendar. That will be our annual celebration this year. That'll be a pretty fun, small affair with the Rex Theater, the new Rex Theater down downtown Manch. You should come check us out. It's going to be a fun night. So with that, without further ado, I want to thank Tricia, Dr. Pion, for your support today, and JerriAnne for coming and giving this presentation again. I want to thank you all for participating. Connie, I don't know if you've got any final call and Zoom without thanking you for your leadership and your support. And so if you got any last words, I'll leave that with you.
No last words. Well, a few last words. We're committed to continuing to support the New Hampshire Humanities because this has been a great program for us and our employees, helping us really think outside the box and think about things that are different than your day-to-day work and enlightening us about all kinds of issues. Thank you so much to JerriAnne for the presentation today. I know people have enjoyed this, and it's about time we further educate ourselves, and this is a good way to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. Everybody have a wonderful day. Stay healthy, and just, onwards and upwards. We're going to be all right. This too shall pass. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good one.